Morning, Ms. Ferry.
Good morning, my lady. First witness this morning is Mr. Alistair Donaldson.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Please sit down.
Thank you.
Morning, Mr. Donaldson.
Mr. Donaldson, your full name, please.
Alistair Donaldson.
Mr. Donaldson, I'd like to ask you some questions about your time working in DHSE's Adult Social Care Policy team. And I think you say in your statement that you started there on the 30th of April 2020 and through until about October of that year. Is that correct?
Until the 2nd of October, yes.
Thank you. By way of background, in your statement, INQ 598578, you set out that you had been working as a senior policy advisor at the British Council and then volunteered for COVID response work.
That's right.
Thank you. And I can see you nodding occasionally, but would you mind just saying yes or no for the stenographer? Thank you very much. In your statement, you make plain that you have no academic background in science or epidemiology.
Correct.
And I think it's right that in preparing your statement, you had limited or indeed no access to emails or minutes or documents to refresh your memory now some 5 years on.
That's right.
Right. I'm going to try and ask for a little bit of detail, but please, I don't want you to guess or speculate. And if you genuinely can't remember the answer, please say so.
Understood.
Now, I think at paragraph 5, and mainly my questions today will be about the Vivaldi project, you said, I was the official responsible for creating the Vivaldi project. And to help you, Mr. Donaldson, we have heard from Professor Laura Shallcross, who led Vivaldi. Can I be clear, what was your precise role or responsibility with the project?
Certainly, and I think I may have muddied the waters slightly here in my statement, because when I talk about Vivaldi, I'm talking about 3 different things, all of which I was the leading, albeit junior, official in charge of. First of all, the surveillance study led by Professor Shallcross. Secondly, the related work to fix the data, in particular the Pillar 2 testing data that my ONS team was leading. And thirdly, my dashboard, which has also been referred to as the Palantir dashboard or just the COVID care home dashboard, they're all the same thing, which came out of that work.
All right,
and I moved between the 3, I realise.
No, well, I'll try and split them up if I may, but please correct me if I guess it wrong. I primarily really want to start with the Vivaldi project and Professor Laura Shallcross's involvement in that. I think Department of Health and Social Care funded the project. Is that correct?
Yes.
And when you arrived at the department on the 30th of April, in your paragraph 6, you describe it as being, quote unquote, complete chaos.
Yes.
Hundreds of staff, you say, had been parachuted in, like you, with no relevant knowledge or experience. Now, to help you, Mr. Donaldson, the department has told us that there was a significant expansion of staff from, I think, about 90 staff at the beginning to over 320, certainly later on in the pandemic. Can you help, the chaos as you describe it, did that help or hinder the setting up of Vivaldi?
Both. The chaos, which was, as you point out, there were hundreds of people like me coming in, and it slightly overwhelmed the HR systems. But what it did mean was that it wasn't always clear to everyone where people sat in the new structures. And I was able to carve out a degree of operational independence for Vivaldi by virtue of reporting both into the adult social care part of the department and also into the Pillar 4 surveillance part led by John Hatwell, which was extremely effective, and it allowed me to get more done than I probably would have been able to achieve otherwise.
And your actual role in Vivaldi itself, Professor Shallcross has described you as a project manager. I hope that's not being pejorative. Is that really what you were, as a kind of middleman between the project and the department?
That's exactly right. So I can claim no credit for the intellectual work behind either Professor Shallcross's study or the Palantir dashboard. I was the muscle, if you like, that got those products seen by the people who mattered.
All right. Sticking with Vivaldi, you say in your statement, obviously we know that April was the month where certainly there was reporting of the huge number of deaths in care homes, particularly related to COVID-19. So that's just where we were in the grand scheme of things. You say you put together a team of non-civil servants, but you were told you needed Public Health England's involvement. And you say in your statement it proved mysteriously difficult to get this involvement. Nobody knew who was responsible for what, and PHE appeared deliberately obstructive. What gave you that impression, Mr. Donaldson?
Yes, so the way it worked was that Sir Jeremy Farrar effectively put me in touch with the relevant parts of the Vivaldi team, and I sort of brought them together and named the project. But I was then told that in order to unlock the funding, I had to have a PHE senior partner, even if they weren't directly working on the project. We eventually got that in Susan Hopkins, but that was only after several weeks of trying to get other people in PHE to play that role and getting nowhere.
Why did you form the impression that PHE appeared deliberately obstructive?
Because I can't find any other explanation of why it was so difficult, given that we weren't asking for people to do extra work. We just needed as it were, a badge, a PHE badge on the project. And we just couldn't get it. And I wasn't the only person who found that. The team that I joined had said that had been a problem that had been going on for a couple of weeks already.
Professor Shallcross told us that she thought at the beginning there might have been a feeling that Vivaldi was treading on toes, to use her words, and filling in gaps that it was perhaps someone else's job to have filled. Does that accord with your recollection of how it was back in April and May 2020?
It does. I mean, we were swimming in their custard and inadvertently showing up problems that they had with their data. And I don't think this was a conscious thing, but I think it was an understandable human reaction that to find that a bit difficult. And no doubt I may have made it worse by the way that I operated, but there was certainly some significant tensions at that stage.
Did you ruffle feathers, Mr. Donaldson, if I can put it colloquially?
I'm sure I did, yes.
You say in your statement that there was a meeting on the 10th of May involving Sir Jeremy and Sir John Bell, who reinforced to you how important Vivaldi was and that resources should not limit it, so you should go on and assemble the team. I just want to ask you, we heard from Professor Shallcross and Professor Hopkins, in fact, 2 days before they had spoken and agreed to set up the study. Can you help with what happened in those 2 days between Professors Hopkins and Shallcross agreeing to set it up and then Sir Jeremy and Sir John speaking to you about assembling the team?
So, not really, because I wasn't in all of the conversations. So I think, and by the way, Susan Hopkins was busy on the Siren study, which was sort of, as it were, the big sister study of Vivaldi that was about hospitals, and so there were clearly conversations going on between the senior scientists, including Professor Shallcross, Susan Hopkins, and Jeremy Farrar, about the need for a study like this in care homes, and then separately, I'd been tasked to do a separate study within the Department of Health. And I was sort of trying to join the two together, if that makes sense.
Mentioned there that Sir Jeremy and Sir John said resources shouldn't limit you. So can I ask you a little bit about the budget? Because you say in your statement there was no significant accessible budget. Can you help us with what you mean and add any context to that, Mr. Donaldson?
Yes, so initially, and I'm talking here about May and into June, we weren't able to access funding immediately for the different parts of the team. We had some very helpful people from Pillar 4 who came in and helped us to fix that over the summer, but the emergency funding that had been available in April, because there weren't systems in place for immediate funding, had been used up on other things. So there was a significant period where we were operating at risk.
I think presumably there were various procurement steps that had to be gone through. Were you involved in those measures?
Yes.
And in due course, was there an issue with funding going on with the Vivaldi project after the summer?
No, one of the reasons I was able to roll off is that we'd effectively won that battle, and we had very significant funding, which then, my understanding is, has continued ever since.
Did the funding issues at the beginning impact the way that the study was able to be set up? Did it have any practical effect, or was it more of a bureaucratic issue, if I may put it like that?
It was a bureaucratic issue. The only practical effect was it wasn't just financial resource, it was people resource. Because I was the only person within the civil service who was working on Vivaldi, it meant that there was an enormous amount of time that was being wasted by having to sort out some of those procedural process issues.
You said there, that I think mentioned that there was a resource issue and you were the only person. You said you were making weekly requests to the department for reinforcements throughout the summer. Why did you need extra staff, and indeed were those requests met?
So those requests weren't met, and I think that was just because, as I said, the HR systems had become overwhelmed. I desperately needed more staff to do things like set up the funding and things like that, because we were everyone on Vivaldi, and indeed almost everyone we worked with, we were all working 100-hour weeks, and there just wasn't enough time in the day to do everything that needed to be done.
So one shouldn't read into that was not a desire to give you the staff, but more that the processes weren't in place to accommodate those requests, given everything else that the department was doing.
That's right, and also, but it wasn't that there weren't enough staff, because there were hundreds of these people who'd been brought in like I had. The problem was that it was very difficult to persuade people that everyone thinks what they're working on is important, but what we were working on, I thought at the time, and I still think, was much more important than where some of those resources were allocated, and it wasn't possible to just move people from one team into another.
Dealing with other potential problems in the setting up of Vivaldi, you make a number of observations throughout your statement about problems obtaining the data.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear about what data we're talking about and then what the problems were. Are you able to help us with that?
Yes, so there's a series of different points here. So first of all, it was difficult for us to, we wanted to ingest all the data we could get from everywhere about care homes so that we could link it together and form an overall picture and then present that to seniors. But different parts of the system owned different data streams and were often reluctant to share them. So, for example, it was difficult to get, from my memory, the deaths data and then the Pillar 1 outbreak testing data from PHE. And it was also difficult because of the extreme speed with which Pillar 2 had been set up. It was a very complicated set of data feeds that came through to us in the data lake, the data foundry, NHS Foundry. So we had to, in order to get the study to work, we had to sort of, as it were, go upstream to find all the blockages and unblock them. And as we did that, we realised that we were solving the problem that was bigger than just the Vivaldi's problem. It was a problem for everyone. And that work then led into what became the dashboard, which was the attempt to get all of the data in one place and analyse it.
Fine, I'm going to come on to the dashboard a little bit later on, but I just want to make sure I understand that answer. You suggest it's not that someone wasn't allowing you access, just that the systems didn't speak to each other, if I may put it like that, or can you help us to what the blockage was?
I think it was probably both. I think the systems didn't speak to each other, and there was a culture of information hoarding, I would suggest, which often made it difficult to get the data. And to be clear, this wasn't a sort of legal data sharing issue. We looked into that and copy notices and so forth. We knew that wasn't the problem. It was a problem of getting different parts of the DHSC and PHE to share with each other and talk to each other.
Right. You did go on to say in your statement, though, that you had arranged for ministerial pressure to be brought to bear here to try and help the blockages with the data. The minister wasn't able to recall that when she gave evidence. Can you help with what the minister actually did to try and unblock the problems?
Yes, certainly. And to be fair to the Minister, there's no reason that she would necessarily have known that that's what she was doing. So I think, in my mind, what happened was there were meetings where we were saying, look, effectively, we've got this data, we don't have this data, Pillar 1 data or deaths data. Would it be possible to have that? And the Minister wouldn't have known that by asking that in front of the very people who we'd been arguing with. It was a bit of a faux pas on my part, but I felt it was necessary to get that pressure from above to get the data unlocked.
She may have facilitated the unblocking without necessarily knowing that she was being asked to unblock.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Can I just stick with the run-up to the findings of Vivaldi, which we know were published in July of 2020? And can I ask you, please, about two specific paragraphs in your statement, at 55 and 56? And you say at paragraph 55 that the new director at the adult social care team asked you, who's telling you to do all this? And you go on to say that Vivaldi and you were then excluded from many of the relevant meetings. And I'd like just some background and context to that comment. Do you know why the new director of the adult social care team was sort of asking you who's telling you to do all this?
Yes. So first of all, and before the moment in July when Vivaldi officially reported, we had been reporting since May. As we got data, we reported it, and that created these tensions that I've described. And so I'm slightly reluctant to sort of pick on one person or incident, but there was a series of moments of which this was an example where it seemed that PHE had spoken to my bosses within the department and effectively said, why are you kind of cutting across us? This is coming out of your team. Why are you trying to do the same thing that we're doing and creating these different reporting?
Right. So was it intergovernmental department
Exactly.
issues there? Did you get the impression that the new director was telling you to stop doing Vivaldi or anything of that nature? I want to be clear.
So it is certainly the case that the new director and indeed others in the hierarchy above me did not want to use Vivaldi for the purposes of the policy making and the winter planning that was going on.
We will come back to that. Put the interdepartmental issues to one side. You go on to say in your statement that in June of 2020, you suspect, after complaints from Public Health England, the then Director General, Ros Rawson, rang you on your personal mobile. Can you remember when this was, Mr. Donaldson, apart from that being that month?
At this stage, I'm afraid not. No.
All right. And you say she phoned you on your personal mobile to ask why I was doing what I was doing in launching Vivaldi and effectively to tell me to stop doing it. Can we be clear now? When you say she effectively told you to stop doing the project, was that her actual words or the impression that she gave?
It wasn't her actual words, but I was under no uncertain impression that that I was being told off for what we were doing and the way we were doing it, and that after that call I shouldn't be continuing in the way that we had been.
Now, can I be clear? Did you get the impression that she wanted you to stop doing the project because she didn't think it had value, or she wanted you to stop the way you had perhaps been manoeuvring things to get the project done and ruffling feathers?
I think it was probably a bit of both, or that's how I interpreted it at the time.
You did not stop what you were doing.
I'm afraid not.
And I think you say in your statement you did not report that conversation with Miss Rawton to your line manager.
No.
All right. Now, that was at some point in June, and as you rightly point out, although the study was published on the 3rd of July, we know from Professor Shallcross that she was reporting preliminary findings in a number of different meetings. She's told us about a DHSE data debrief meeting on a Thursday and a SAGE social care working group, or PHE, meeting on a Friday. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Data debrief on a Thursday, SAGE on a Friday. Professor Shawcross told us that she was reporting preliminary findings to the data debrief group
Yes.
without any difficulty. She also says she shared the Vivaldi findings in the Friday meetings from the 30th of June. That was the date she was able to put on it. You look askance there, Mr. Donaldson.
No,
Does that not accord with your recollection?
There is no disagreement between me and Laura, Professor Shawcross, on that. But what I would say is that we'd been making interventions into the Friday SAGE working group since May, to my memory.
All right. Perhaps matters not, because it was going into both meetings. But you do say in your statement, in relation to the SAGE care home group working meetings, you had to gate crash a June SAGE care home meeting. I suspect, do you remember now which one?
So, and forgive me, I am now not even convinced it was June rather than May. I
Right.
honestly can't remember.
Okay.
But what I can remember very clearly, and I think I may not have allowed Laura to know quite how difficult the battle was with the Secretariat to get her in. I didn't want to professionally embarrass her, but initially it was very difficult to get into those meetings and present. But to be fair, the chair, Ian Hall, had an admirably open chairing, it was like a tutorial almost. He was very happy to take interventions. So once we were in and reporting, it became quite easy for us to start to be a formal part of that structure.
Did you get the sense that Vivaldi was being deliberately excluded, or it just takes a time to invite a new person to a new meeting and have some familiarity with how those meetings are run?
I think there was perhaps initially a little bit of a sense of, who are these new people and why are they kind of...
Let me ask you this. Do you think there was a desire not to hear the findings of Vivaldi as they emerged?
I think there may have been a purely subconscious reluctance from parts of PHE to hear that we were inadvertently showing up problems with their data, because Vivaldi immediately found that they had been significantly underreporting.
Yeah. So to be clear to people who are perhaps not as familiar with this as you are, Mr. Donaldson, we know in due course that PHE found a relatively low number of infections for various reasons, and indeed we're aware of the retrospective study that they did in July 2021, which found a seeding of 1.6%. Of hospital discharges led to infections in care homes. Vivaldi was reporting slightly higher figures than that. But I'll come on to hospital discharge as a discrete topic.
Yes, okay.
All right. But generally speaking, there was lower numbers being reported by PHE than the Vivaldi findings.
So significantly lower, and also we weren't just finding that there were more cases, we were also finding that there had been more cases, because we could see from the antibodies that many people had the infection without it having shown up.
That just helps contextualise it for those who are perhaps less familiar watching. You say in your statement that when the results were delivered, there was a suggestion that the Vivaldi results needed to be packaged as SAGE advice. Can you help explain what you mean there?
Yes, and to be clear, I don't think that's quite right. I think that the thing that was extremely concerning was that when we finally published the results at the beginning of July, we'd already been reporting the extra cases and some of these risk factors around staff movement and sick pay and cohorting and so on. But there was a new and very important finding, which was that only about half of the care homes had any cases. Yeah. So there was a big danger with the second wave with no natural immunity. And also that, and this cut against the modelling, that the people in small care homes, which was about 2/3 of the care homes, were per capita pretty much just as under just as much risk as people in large care homes. And the initial drafts of the winter planning were going to focus what was limited testing resource just on the larger care homes. And what I had to do was get SAGE to reconsider that based on the Vivaldi findings that they were all at risk, right, and then get the department to take that on board.
can I just ask you about the retrospective PHC study and the 1.6% findings? In your statement, and it's at paragraph 39, Mr. Donaldson, you have said that the great caution is needed in interpreting 2020 PHE care home data. And we're familiar with the lack of testing in January, February, March, at least up until about the 15th of April, all right? And you were worried about the use of that data. And indeed, you said in terms that you were worried that it did not tally with what Vivaldi had uncovered, and it carried a substantial risk of the system marking its own homework. It was not being checked by independent epidemiologists with no dog in the fight or intellectual or professional interest at stake. Can I ask you, please, to explain what it was you were worried about, and whether you are suggesting there that perhaps they have either done something inappropriate with the data or they've wanted to cover up the data? I just want to be very clear about what it is you're saying.
Certainly, and this will take a minute to explain, if I may.
Take your time.
So I think there are briefly three problems with this, because whether it's the Vivaldi study in the summer or subsequent studies in the autumn and the following year, asking the question, what are the routes in for COVID to get into care homes, is a different question from asking what are the causes of excess deaths in care homes. And it is dangerous, and I've seen this throughout, that for perfectly understandable reasons, those two things have a tendency to be conflated. So whether it's Vivaldi looking at data from May, because we didn't have any testing data from the time when most of the excess deaths happened, or subsequently, by changing, this is the first point, by changing expanding this time horizon, you're effectively expanding a denominator with things that aren't relevant to one of those two questions. The second point is the cases are defined by the testing. So both the numerator and the denominator, if you're saying, oh, well, this case came from a hospital and then we found it again in a care home, that would only be the case if you had tested for it in the hospital, which in March you would have only done for symptomatic cases, which were not as dangerous because people knew to isolate them. And the third point, and I haven't seen this anywhere else, but I think it's really important. Even if a very small proportion of entries of COVID into care homes came with, let us say, hospital discharge, untested hospital discharge, that doesn't mean that only a small proportion of the excess deaths would have been caused by that by any means, because although all entry of COVID into care homes was dangerous, some was much more dangerous than others. And asymptomatic ingress at the end of March, let us say, untested into care homes that weren't protected, was very much more dangerous and likely to cause more cases than something that happened in May or down the line. And so when I say marking, to be clear, I'm not suggesting any impropriety. I just think that because of a limited number of people working in this field, I think that there is a danger of us as a system marking our own homework.
Thank you. I just wanted to be clear about what it was you were saying there. Thank you. One of the other things that you speak of in your statement is references to the inquiry in meetings that you attended. And I think you said at your paragraph 69 that there was comments made such as, come the inquiry, we'll have to be able to say X or Y, or the inquiry will ask us A, B or C. Can you give us any context in which phrases like that were said, and whether that was people covering themselves, it was saying from a defensive point, or it was said from we need to have a clear audit trail so we can remember this when we go to the inquiry many years down the line? Help us with the context, please.
Certainly, and to be clear, in terms of context and in terms of your last suggestion, this is definitely not the sort of thing that you would ever see paper trailed. This would have been oral comments in meetings. And I want to very clearly state, I don't think that this was, I'm not suggesting that there was some kind of conspiracy or cover-up here. It was just very striking to me as a then non-civil servant that it was a cultural habit, if you like, or culturally acceptable to say, well, there's going to focus on the fact that there was going to be an inquiry, and therefore that people, I think, were reluctant to take initiative or responsibility for things that weren't immediately within their explicit remit. And what that meant was that there was a greater likelihood of sins of omission than sins of commission, if that makes sense.
Different topic, please, and the dashboard data. In your witness statement that you say you were told not to share it with ministers, local authorities, Cabinet Office number 10, and you went on to say you granted access to everyone in local or central government who requested it. We've in fact seen emails where there was various access was granted to all those people, but can you help us with the reference to why you were told not to share it with ministers and other government departments?
Yes. So, and to be fair, the context of this is I'd asked for this dashboard to be created sort of without anyone asking me to do it, because I knew that we had all this valuable data, and we had, I can't claim credit for it, Gemma Hallett from Palantir had created this excellent tool. I could see how powerful it was going to be for the second wave that we could already see from the data in this dashboard was coming. But I was very sort of surprised that my seniors on the adult social care side were not using it to report upwards to ministers. They were still using the flawed PHE data, and I didn't feel that they necessarily understood either the data itself or the potential power of this dashboard. So I confess I did use my control over the login access, or my initial control over the login access, to share it as widely as I could.
Because you wanted to see what potentially was able to show us infections at national level, regional level. As we understand it, it went down in due course to care home level.
Even at the start in August, it went down to that level of granularity, individual care homes. And the thing that was terrific about Minister Whately is that she really wanted to interrogate the data and was then able to follow up and effectively ring up individual care homes or local authorities and say, look, we can see you've got a problem here. What is it? How can we help? So. Because in August we could see that the second wave was taking off, we thought it was absolutely urgent to get this out to as many people as possible.
Right. And just, you mentioned there, Minister Whately, you say you were told by your director not to share it with the minister and had to give briefings to the minister in secret without your own senior managers knowing until the data became recognised as too valuable to stop. Now, the minister didn't recall being briefed in secret. Maybe she wouldn't know about that. But are you able to provide any background or context as to why you had to brief the minister in secret, as you describe it?
Yes, and again, to be fair, there's no reason the minister... So this was... I effectively had a good relationship with Minister Whately's private office, and the fact we were all in lockdown here was our friend, because usually a junior official would find it difficult to get into the physical room with the minister, but on Teams it was quite easy to say to the private office, I think the minister will want to see this, can you add me to the invitation list? So my bosses would, to their slight horror I'm sure, would suddenly see me turning up in a meeting without anyone having asked me to be there. But they were reluctant, I think, to take responsibility for this product which I had asked to be created and which did not have PHE sort of approval or badging on it.
Once the dashboard was shared with a number of different people and bodies, did you get any sense then that people were not grateful or didn't appreciate the value of the data that the dashboard could tell us?
I think in general, people were extremely pleased with the dashboard because it was a very powerful tool for the second wave.
Can I ask you one final question, please? And it's about your paragraph 111. And it may help if we have up on screen, please. Thank you very much. Page 35. Now, some of the other witnesses that Her Ladyship has heard from have been asked about this paragraph, and I'd like your observations on it. But you say, by way of summary, we had to create Vivaldi because PHE and DHSE, adult social care policy teams, had failed to do so. We had to use outsiders because they wouldn't and perhaps couldn't do it themselves. Parts of the Public Health England and the department effectively tried to stop Vivaldi happening, then tried to stop it reporting, then tried to avoid acting on the results, then tried to stop the creation and use of our dashboard. Having tried to stop our initial report, PHE first tried to ignore it, then tried to steal it and present it as their own, tried to reinterpret it as justifying its own previous policy failings. And you go on to say DHSE refused to share data even when ordered to by ministers and regularly proposed not telling ministers important information. I believe that all this suggests a pattern of dysfunction that helps to explain why things were so bad with the care home policy making at the start of the pandemic and give broader clues as to the systemic problems COVID revealed. Now, next line of paragraph 112 hasn't been shown before, but you go on to say, in my view, none of this was because of bad faith or malicious or lazy individuals. It was rather part of a wider problem of systemic bureaucratic inflexibility, and you go on. Now, wider systemic issues are perhaps not within the remit of this inquiry, but certainly Professor Hopkins was asked about this paragraph, and she said she didn't recognise the matters that you set out there and would like to see the evidence upon which it was based. Do you have any additional comment to make about what are, on any view, relatively strong criticisms there of both PHE and the department, and any other context you would like to add to that paragraph, Mr. Donaldson?
Yes, so first of all, I'd like to point out I say parts of. I'm not trying to be too blanket in this. And of course, it was different parts doing different bits of this. So I think this paragraph only makes sense in the context of my wider statement, but I still think it's an accurate summary. And as I say, to make it clear, everybody was working extremely hard, and I didn't see any evidence of anyone doing anything inappropriate individually, but it was an enormous struggle against a set of systemic problems.
My lady, they're all the questions I asked, but I think there is one core participant who's been
There is
some questions.
Thank you, my lady. Good morning, Mr. Donaldson. I ask questions on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. And I have just got 3 questions for you, please, which relate to your evidence as to the impact of the hospital discharge policy. So the first one is this. The inquiry has heard evidence about the limitations of the PHE data linkage study, given how constrained testing capacity was in March and April 2020. And you've touched on that this morning. As Ms. Carey King's counsel noted at the outset, you stress fairly at the beginning of your statement that you have no academic background in science or epidemiology. Yeah. But is such a background necessary to recognise those limitations?
So, to be clear, I had a team of epidemiological and statistical experts who were helping me throughout that summer to interpret the raw data that we were looking at. And it was my job as a policymaker to summarise their findings and interpret them for the purposes of policy. So
is the answer no, that you were able to do that within the parameters of your role, relying on those experts?
So I think precisely because I had those experts in my team to help me, I think that I make absolutely no claims for my own knowledge, but I think I was in a good position from where I was sitting to understand the data, yes.
Thank you. Second, please, you also say in your statement that given those data constraints, it's not possible to prove definitively whether the hospital discharge policy was the cause of significant numbers of unnecessary infections and deaths, but nevertheless you say you believe it probably was. How were you able to come to that conclusion?
My personal belief. So, just because of Occam's razor, I suppose, if you take lots of people who from hospitals full of COVID and put them into a vulnerable setting without testing them, given how many asymptomatic cases there were, it would be surprising if that did not cause, unfortunately, further cases and deaths. And the problem for all of us who were working on these issues at the time is that policy was was difficult to analyse for the same reason it's been controversial. There were no tests, so it was impossible to know which of those people, unfortunately, were infected.
Finally, Mr. Donaldson, in your statement, you describe a generational slaughter within care homes, and that's clearly not everyday language. Why, or what prompted you to use such strong language in the context of the hospital discharge policy?
Well, I think I use it in the context of the overall situation. I was asked to give this witness statement in my own words, and I can't think of a better form of words given the horrible scale of the tragedy in the care homes, particularly in that first wave. We're talking about something like 27,000 excess deaths in the space of a few weeks, and of course, unfortunately, concentrated because of the nature of the virus on one particular generation.
Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stone. That completes the questions we have for you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you very much for your help for coming today to assist the inquiry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My lady, the next witness is Jeane Freeman, and I'm going to hand over to Miss Jung.
Hello again, Ms. Freeman.
Good morning.
Take you through the swearing in. Are you swearing on the Bible?
Yes, I am.
Take the Bible in your right hand, please. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my
Ms.
lady.
Jung.
Ms. Freeman, can you start by confirming your full name, please?
It's, excuse me, it's Jeane Freeman.
Thank you. And thank you for coming today to assist the inquiry for, I think, the 5th time. Is that right?
Yes.
The statement that you've produced for this module is at INQ 000606530, and I understand that you have a copy of that.
I do.
Thank you. Dealing first with professional background, you served as the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport in Scotland between June 2018 and May 2021. After that, you did not stand for re-election and you did not have any further involvement in the Scottish Government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Is that correct?
It is.
Prior to being appointed as the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, you served as Minister for Social Security. Previous to that, you worked as a senior civil servant in education. You worked also as a special advisor, had a decorated career in social justice, and you originally trained and qualified as a nurse. Is that all correct?
All correct, yes.
Did you have any professional experience in adult social care before your appointment as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport?
No.
Dealing then with your role as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, you had primary responsibility for the Health and Social Care Directorates and also NHS Scotland, is that right?
That's correct.
That included primary care, allied healthcare services, vaccines and therapeutics, healthcare and social integration, and carers and adult care. Is
That's
that right?
correct.
Did you also have lead responsibility for a number of public bodies, including NHS Scotland, the Care Inspectorate, the Scottish Services Council and Sport Scotland?
Yes.
And dealing then with your role during the pandemic, is it right that you were primarily responsible for health and social care? And in terms of the areas that are relevant to this module, you had responsibility for adult social care policy, setting direction, and making decisions on resourcing and strategic decisions. However, you did not make day-to-day operational decisions on adult social care. Is that correct?
That's correct, because, of course, the statutory responsibility for delivery of adult social care sits with our local authorities.
Thank you. Can I ask you about levers, please?
Yes.
At paragraph 6 of your statement, you make the point that, unlike healthcare, the social government does not have direct statutory responsibility for the delivery of adult social care, the point that you've just made. To what extent did that constrain your ability to direct and coordinate the social care sector's response to the pandemic?
So it is a constraint, in as much as, in terms of the NHS, then particularly using the legislation, it was possible for me to direct what we were doing in our health service. It's not the case that a health secretary has the power to direct what happens in adult social care, whether that is in a residential or an at-home setting. That sits with local authorities and with their umbrella body, COSLA. And so the way in which you work is to reach agreement with COSLA on those matters that you've just described, the strategic approach, the resourcing, but then you are dealing with individual stakeholders. And as you know, adult social care in Scotland is delivered by a range of agencies, both private and public.
Thank you. Is it the case that local authorities and health boards delegate their social care duties to, in the majority of cases, what are called integrated joint boards? They then set the strategy and commission the work, and adult social care is delivered by what are called health and social care partnerships.
Broadly speaking, that is correct. Health and social care partnerships will then commission the delivery of adult social care. So that might be to the private sector, or in some instances, local authorities deliver that directly by employing the staff themselves to do that.
Thank you. And I think the only health board that's slightly different is Highland, where the NHS board is responsible for adult social care, I think, and the local authority is responsible for children's social care. Is that right?
Yes.
Can I ask you for clarification, please? At paragraph 6, you say, while Scottish ministers can issue directions to local authorities, health boards and integration joint boards, health and social care partnerships, you do not have statutory powers to issue directions to care providers. Can you just be clear, please? What levers did you have during the pandemic as far as the adult social care response was concerned?
In terms of the providers, or do you mean in terms of the providers?
In terms of directing the response, so whether that, we know that you didn't have any power to direct the care home providers, but as far as the integrated joint boards of the health and social care partnerships were concerned,
yes,
and also the local authorities and the health boards, can you tell us what levers you did have, please?
So there are some statutory levers, but at the same time, we have to remember that individual local authorities are themselves democratically elected bodies. So you have to respect the democratic basis of a local authority. So the bulk of the work in practice involves discussion and agreement, which is why, as I think I say in my witness statement and have said previously, the quality of the relationship with COSLA, and in particular their lead member for social care, was critical to being able to secure agreement on our overall approach, on resourcing, on additional support that might be needed, and so on.
So is my understanding correct then that you did have some statutory levers, but you chose not to use them for the reasons that you've just stated?
No, I wouldn't say I chose not to use them. there was limited difficulty in securing agreement between myself and COSLA on the direction of travel and what needed to be done, both in the overall strategic approach and in some of the detail of delivery. Where there were issues, it arose in terms of individual providers. And on occasion, to be fair, with individual local authorities.
Looking back then, are there any particular levers that you wish you had at your disposal, or are there any, in hindsight, you wish you had used differently?
I think that's a difficult question. There are none with hindsight that I wish I had used differently, given what was available to me at the time. I think my answer to the second part of your question about what would I like to have had but didn't have is really picked up in some of the recommendations of the Feely report. So the key one there is about securing consistency of standards across adult social care provision in Scotland, where prior to the pandemic and indeed during the pandemic, there were differences in the consistency of delivery of some of the requirements we made. For example, visiting guidance in some instances, that it would be best to not have that inconsistency. And the comparison I'd make is where you have inconsistency in the delivery of healthcare between one health board and another, there are various steps that Scottish Government can take to address that, both through our clinical teams, but also directly through our NHS Scotland, but also as government. Those steps are not as available in adult social care. So inconsistency of delivery is unfair on those receiving the care.
And I think, in fact, during the pandemic, you exercised your emergency powers to put the NHS on an emergency footing. Is that right? And did that give you control? I think you refer to it in your statement as the NHS acting as one single unit.
Yeah.
Is that the kind of lever that you would recommend should be in place in future to give ministers, allow them to be better equipped to lead a response in the future?
So, for accuracy, I used the legislation that allows a health secretary, I think it's the 78 legislation, allows a health secretary to put the NHS onto an emergency footing. That means that I could use powers if required. As it happens, I did not require to because our NHS all faced in the same direction and so on. I think it's worth consideration in terms of adult social care, but I can see complications with that because the provision of adult social care is split between private and public. Whereas our NHS in Scotland is a publicly provided, entirely publicly funded healthcare service. So the basis on which an elected government minister can direct that publicly funded agency is clear. I think it is less clear where you have that mix of provision. So I'm not discounting that. I think it's worthy of some consideration, but I can see complexity in that.
Thank you. Can I ask for your general reflections on a number of matters, please? In your view, what aspects of the adult social care response in Scotland went well?
So I think, without exception, the response of staff working in adult social care, both in residential settings and at home, was exemplary. In many instances, staff sacrificed time with their own families in order to deliver as safe care as they could In some instances, staff left their homes and lived in the residential setting where they were providing care. So I think the response of adult social care staff was absolutely exemplary. I think overall, the relationship with Scottish Care and with COSLA worked very well. And we benefited from a range of clinical expert advice on the care and vulnerabilities of the population, particularly those cared for in residential settings.
Were there any particular decisions where you feel, with the benefit of hindsight, alternative actions may have led to a better outcome?
So, I think if I was currently dealing with a pandemic, then I think more consideration could have been given to the impact on those receiving adult social care of some of the measures introduced in order to safeguard them from the virus. So I'm thinking particularly of those in residential care who suffer from dementia, for example, but also younger adults, perhaps with learning disabilities or other issues in residential care, who also suffered from the imposition of restrictions on their movement, on being outside. But at the time, I did not believe there was a reasonable alternative to balance that concern against the overriding concern to try and prevent the transmission of the virus to a vulnerable population.
Thank you. Was the adult social care sector, in your view, the poor relation to the NHS in Scotland?
No, I don't believe it was in terms of my actions with respect to how we would respond to the pandemic in that setting. I think, though, it is clear that the adult social care sector is disadvantaged in terms of the terms and remuneration to the staff who work in that sector and the absence of clear career progression, all of which makes it difficult to attract the numbers of staff that you would need to that profession. That is complicated, as we've said before, by restrictions that arose from Brexit, but the fundamental problem is the terms and conditions. And that was one of the reasons, for example, why during the pandemic we intervened in order to provide sick pay to those whose terms and conditions of employment provided nothing more than statutory sick pay, and made it very difficult then for staff who wanted to comply with our requirements, for example, if they had COVID themselves, or more often a member of their family did, with our requirements for them to stay at home. That was a financial loss that we stepped in to try and alleviate so they could comply. But that is because their terms and conditions of employment were poor.
Thank you. Do you think there was a fair balance and a broad enough range of adult social care voices that informed decision-making during the pandemic?
Yes, I do. I think Scottish Care was a key and critical voice, critical both in its importance and at times in terms of what it said. And I had many meetings with Scottish Care, multiplied a number of times by the number of meetings my officials would have had. We also benefited from specific clinical advice in terms of geriatrician advice. And I did myself meet care home providers and adult social care providers. There were other organisations too that raised concerns and we had discussions with, particularly those who represented adults with disabilities or with learning difficulties.
What changes do you think are needed to ensure that adult social care in Scotland is better understood, recognised and equally prioritised alongside the NHS in future pandemic planning and response?
So I would not agree that it wasn't prioritised alongside the NHS in our pandemic response, and I think it's important for me to say that. But as we look ahead to what we need to do for the next pandemic that will appear, I think many, if not all, of the recommendations from the Feely report should be implemented. I think, as I've said before, that our testing infrastructure needs to be, as a base level, better than it was at the start of the pandemic we're discussing. And I think we need to, and in terms of the Feely report, that is about agreed national standards, consistently applied across the country in whatever setting adult social care is delivered, and inspected and regulated to ensure that that is happening, and where it's not, that steps are taken to achieve those improvements. That all also links into how, as any Scottish government works with and seeks to offer people with disabilities the equity of opportunity that those of us without that enjoy or have before us.
Looking back, do you consider that the care at home sector and unpaid carers received sufficient and timely attention and support from the Scottish Government during the pandemic, particularly in comparison with care homes?
So the care at home sector was included in the additional supply of PPE that we introduced. So the concern about the supply of PPE to residential social care first flagged up the problem that existed, to which our response was then to use our National Services Agency, which supplies PPE to our NHS, to increase the volume of supply and the routes to include residential care, but also care at home and unpaid carers, personal assistants and a range of others. And you'll know from the material that's already been provided to the inquiry the various routes that we implemented in order to ensure that that was the case. I don't recall specific issues being raised with me in terms of care at home, with one exception, and that does relate to PPE, where from the trade unions representing staff delivering care at home, they raised a concern that their members, in some instances, were not given an adequate supply of PPE to deal with the number of individuals in any given day that they would be visiting to provide care. I made the determination that those staff in all circumstances should be given, if they were visiting, for example, 5 clients, they should be given 5 full sets of PPE and allowed to use their professional judgment on what PPE was appropriate for each individual.
Thank you.
So that was one specific instance, but there were, I don't recall others being raised directly with me in terms of adult social care.
So the question was, do you think that they did receive sufficient support and attention, and were they prioritised alongside care homes?
Yes, for me, yes, they were. And in terms of all the issues that came to me for me to then address in the practical delivery of our work, I don't recall any that were raised that I did not address.
do you think that anything more can be done to increase the recognition and visibility of unpaid carers and the care at home sector in Scotland?
So I think that in terms of the, if you like, the narrative around adult social care, too often we collectively confine our thinking to only those in residential settings and confine our thinking to the elderly, where, as I've said, adult social care is also a vital service to many much younger people, which, provided properly to meet their individual needs, allow them to, for example, go to work, meet their friends, have the kind of opportunities in terms of education and otherwise that those of us more fortunate take for granted. So I think there is an attitudinal question that needs to be addressed with respect to adult social care as you would broadly define it and properly define it.
Thank you. Can I move on to a different topic, please, which is pre-pandemic preparedness and plans? In your Module 1 evidence, Ms Freeman, you accepted that there were several key lessons from exercises Cygnus, Silver Swan and Iris that had not been implemented or fully implemented by the time the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. Can you tell us what risks were known to you as at January 2020 regarding the pandemic preparedness or lack thereof of the adult social care sector in Scotland, please?
I do not recall specific risks being raised with me with respect to the adult social care sector in terms of lessons from those exercises that have not been implemented. What was clear and was discussed many, many times was the overall vulnerability of that sector and its disparate nature. And that was what factored in to our thinking and our planning, and with the help of specialist advice in terms of geriatric care, the issues I've already touched on in terms of the particular vulnerabilities that were not clinical vulnerabilities, but other vulnerabilities of that group.
One of the recommendations that was not fully implemented was that local plans should integrate the health and social care partnerships. Did you have oversight at the start of the pandemic as to how many of the health and social care partnerships had been fully implemented or integrated into the local pandemic plans?
No, I didn't.
Is that something that you think a minister should have oversight of at the start of a pandemic, not only to assure themselves of the existence and the adequacy of the plans, but also to inform the response of the sector?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I think our colleagues in Scottish Care and otherwise have made the point about that sector being represented more consistently in non-pandemic times at that level of strategic decision making. And I think that is a very fair point.
Can I ask you about the initial period of planning and response? So focusing for now on the months of January and February 2020, please. And could I ask to be shown on screen INQ 000238703, please, page 4. And if we could focus on paragraphs 15, 17, please. Can you see in paragraph 16, it says 3 lines up from the bottom, planning included work to assess the vulnerability of the social care sector. You see that?
Yes.
Can you tell us what specific work was done in relation to assessing the vulnerability of the social care sector and what the findings were, please?
So this was work undertaken by officials and it would be undertaken in consultation with, for example, Scottish Care, to look at, and the Care Inspectorate, to look at Care Inspectorate reports up to that point, identifying any particular residential settings where improvements were needed and how that had been progressed or not, and also looking at the mix of agencies in the delivery of social care. So, for example, what proportion of adult social care delivery was direct from local authorities, in that they employed the staff to do that, and then in the private sector, what was the mix between large-scale operations and small operations, a single care home run, but the operators only had one care home, compared to others where maybe there was more than one.
Do you think there were any steps that could have been taken in those early months to try and deal with some of the vulnerability issues going into the pandemic?
No, I'm not sure that there are any steps at that point that were not addressed that should have been addressed.
Can I ask you about some early correspondence, please, between Professor Woolhouse and the then Chief Medical Officer? You were asked about correspondence in Module 2A. Was it fed back to you that in January, Professor Woolhouse had warned Ms. Calderwood, who was the then CMO, that an integrated surveillance system that combined clinical surveillance, genomic surveillance and serological surveillance and data sharing was needed, and that should be set up in advance of the pandemic arriving in Scotland?
So that level of detail was not provided to me by Professor Calderwood, but I was aware that she was in touch with Professor Woolhouse, and I think met him, along with other experts in the field of epidemiology or virology, who were also in contact with her or her colleagues, expressing views and offering advice.
Did you take any steps in January and February in relation to building up the data infrastructure in relation to adult social care?
At that point, no.
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, but can I just ask, is it a level of detail that you wouldn't expect a minister to be alert to if we're talking about a surveillance system or we're talking about data infrastructure? Isn't that the kind of detail that ought to come to the minister?
So I understood what our existing surveillance system was, and if Professor Calderwood had thought that that should be improved in any respect, then she would have raised that with me and we would have discussed how that might have been done. I don't recall that being raised with me, but I did understand the existing surveillance system that we had, which was primarily through GP practices.
And could I just ask you, while we're on this topic, what the existing data system was in relation to adult social care, and in particular, whether there was any real-time data available in relation to care homes?
So there was real-time data available through the Care Inspectorate. It depends what kind of data you're meaning. So the existing or the pre-existing surveillance system, the Sentinel system through our GP practices, would encompass care homes, and that is around infection primarily. Other data around the provision of care, the quality of care, would come through the adequacy of staffing and so on, would be data that would be available through the Care Inspectorate.
Thank you. My lady, I see the time. I can either deal with the short topic now or it would be convenient.
I'll return at 11:30.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you, my lady. Ms. Freeman, in your Module 2A evidence, you said that the Scottish Government's knowledge of and complete understanding of how the adult social care sector operated was not as adequate at the outset as it needed to be. And some other areas of understanding, particularly of the care at home sector, was not adequate at the outset. First of all, was that a reference to your own personal understanding or the government's understanding?
I think both.
And in what ways was your understanding and the Scottish Government's understanding of how the sector operated inadequate?
So I think the most important way, I think both I and the Scottish Government, i.e. officials, understood the structure of adult social care sector, the delivery of the adult social care sector, and importantly, the contractual arrangements around the delivery of adult social care. Where, importantly, I think there was less understanding was a presumption, certainly on my part, that the 2012 National Manual for Infection Prevention and Control, which is the obligation to deliver infection prevention and control according to that manual, is part of the contract that providers have. My presumption was that that was understood, that staff were trained consistently across the piece to know what to do, and it was being delivered. I think from early in the pandemic response, it became clear that that was not consistently the case.
You said in your Module 2A evidence that there were some presumptions made which, as you worked through the days, became clear could not stand. You've just referred to one of those presumptions there. Yeah. Were there any other presumptions made which turned out not to be true?
I don't believe so, but I think, for example, this is not a presumption. Well, arguably it might be, but I don't see it as a presumption. The difficulties that the sector faced in securing adequate PPE. So that had never been a difficulty raised, I don't believe, with government in any respect prior to the pandemic. But of course was raised during the pandemic because it was a global pandemic. There was global demand for PPE, and individual care homes and indeed individual local authorities seeking relatively small volume of PPE were being pushed out of the market, if you like.
Thank you.
And that's why we intervened. I'm not sure that's a presumption, but it is certainly an issue that arose early in the pandemic, which had not been an issue pre-pandemic.
We'll come to PPE a bit later, but could I just ask you this, that in relation to the recommendations made pre-pandemic, one of them was that there wasn't enough awareness of the PPE stockpile and of the distribution. Is that something that you were aware of was an issue in relation to the adult social care sector pre-pandemic?
No, because the PPE stockpile was not necessarily something that they pre-pandemic would have access to.
In a pandemic?
In a pandemic, they would do.
Yes, and so I think the recommendation was saying that staff did not have enough knowledge that such a stockpile existed to be accessed in the event of a pandemic.
Okay.
So is that something you're aware of pre-pandemic?
No, but I was aware of very early in 2020 because I believe Mr. McCaskill raised it with me.
Thank you. On a podcast in April 2021, you said this: "I think our failures were not understanding the social care sector well enough. So we didn't respond quickly enough to what was needed in our care homes, but also in social care in the community." Have you reflected, Ms. Freeman, as to why, as the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, primarily responsible for social care during the pandemic, your knowledge of the sector was not adequate?
Yes, I have, and I believe I've just explained in what way it was.
It may be my fault for not asking the question clear enough. The question is, why wasn't your knowledge adequate?
Because I think the presumption that I made about infection prevention and control in the adult social care sector was a presumption made across government.
Across the whole of government?
Well, health and social care.
Do you think that as a minister you should have been asking questions where things were unclear in your mind?
I think I should have, and I did.
In your Module 6 statement, you say at paragraph 72, I do have a good understanding of the adult social care sector in Scotland and took this into consideration when making key decisions. Can you please clarify, does that represent a change in your position, or should we take that to read that you're referring there to decisions made later in the pandemic because you've just accepted that your knowledge at the beginning of the pandemic was not adequate?
No, I think what you should take it as is that from the outset, from being appointed to Cabinet Secretary in 2018, I understood the structure, contractual nature and multiplicity of agencies delivering adult social care. So in that sense, I had a good understanding of how adult social care was delivered and the requirement of government in terms of funding, strategic decision-making and so on. I understood about integrated health and social care and the health and social care partnerships you've referred to earlier. The practicality of delivery is something that early on in responding to the pandemic became much clearer to me, and that is where I would say my understanding was not as full as I needed it to be at the outset, but I have to say I think it became pretty full pretty early on.
Thank you. You say at paragraph 166 of your statement that any assumption that dealing more effectively with the issue of delayed discharge in March 2020 increased the risk of introduction or transmission of COVID-19 to care homes is, in my view, based on limited, if any, evidence. Can you clarify, please, is that a view that you held at the time when you were making the discharge decision?
At the time when I was making the discharge decision, as I think I've explained previously, 2 points. First of all, it's really important in all the decisions that were made during our response to the pandemic to understand that these were not binary decisions. They were not decisions between a self-evidently risk-free approach and a risk approach. They were decisions between levels of risk. And so I understood when I was making the decision to ask that delayed discharge be paid attention to, which had been a position prior to the pandemic on my part and many previous Cabinet Secretaries, that in doing that, we needed to also ensure that mitigation measures were put in place in care homes. But we were looking to remove where they were clinically ready to be discharged from hospital, individuals from a high-risk environment, i.e. a hospital, where we expected large numbers of COVID patients as well as other hospital infections, to an environment that was, relatively speaking, less risky, plus those additional mitigation measures.
Can we move on, please, to the discharge?
Sorry, just before you do, I'm sorry
yes,
to
of
interrupt.
course.
I'm just trying to get straight in my own head what you're saying, Ms. Freeman. I haven't listened to the podcast, forgive me, but I understood from Ms. Young's questioning that you said the lack of understanding across Scottish Government, including your own, had led to a delayed response. But you've just told Ms. Young that you had full understanding of structural, contractual nature, the multiplicity of agencies, and you pretty early on had a pretty full understanding of the practicalities of delivery. I'm not quite squaring the two, because if you pretty early on got a full understanding, then there wouldn't have been any delayed response, would there?
I'm not sure there was a delayed response, my lady.
I thought that's what you said in the podcast.
I may have done, but reflecting on it now, I don't believe there was a delayed response from us.
It may be that you were referring to the April enhanced oversight package of measures.
It may have been, but that podcast was some time ago, and I have not listened to it, so I'm not entirely sure.
Thank you. Can we turn to the discharge policy in March, please? There are a number of areas in which the inquiry seeks clarification in relation to this policy. Dealing first with your role and accountability, you say at paragraph 122 of your statement that the Scottish Government did not make individual discharge decisions. Scottish ministers do not have powers and did not place named individuals in named care homes. Those types of discharge decisions are to be made on a case-by-case basis with clinical input. What the Scottish Government did do was to ask local authorities, through their adult social care staff, to prioritise and put additional effort into reducing delayed discharges in their hospitals. So, putting aside the individual decisions, do you accept that the Scottish Government did direct social care staff to reduce delayed discharges and that, in fact, targets were set for them to do so?
Yes, but that was no different from the pre-pandemic position. If we look at, excuse me, the work that I was undertaking in 2019, that was to reduce delayed discharge, because delaying someone's discharge from hospital because the social care support is not in place is detrimental to that individual, particularly to an individual who's elderly, in terms of both their physical and their mental health.
And as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, do you accept ultimate accountability for that decision and the consequences of it?
Yes.
Turning to the rationale for the discharge policy, the inquiry understands that the first positive COVID case in Scotland was confirmed on the 1st of March, and that it was around this time that it was realised in SAGE and throughout the UK that community transmission was further along than initially thought. Did that change in understanding influence the pace and urgency of hospital discharges into care settings?
So, in terms of preparing our hospitals to be ready to receive the worst case scenario of number of people expected to contract COVID and to require hospitalisation, and those of that number to require intensive care, a number of steps were taken, of which a focus on delayed discharge was but one, and arguably the greatest impact was the pausing of elective care. So delayed discharge had always been on the desk of a health secretary. It was on my desk. And
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't dispute that. The question is, did that change in understanding influence the urgency and the pace of the need to discharge patients into care settings?
No.
No, thank you. Can I just deal with some of the chronology as background context, please? You were asked in Module 2A about an email from the First Minister asking whether sector-specific guidance needed to be issued because it had come to her attention that one particular care home was refusing admissions. Is it right that on the 11th of March, so the next day, there was a submission in relation to care homes closing their doors, and it was in response to Scottish Care indicating that 4 large corporate care home providers had closed their doors to new admissions and had restricted visitors to care homes, and that there was a worry that smaller providers would follow suit. As I've mentioned, that issue had been raised previously by the First Minister the previous day. The submission indicated that Health Protection Scotland had been urgently asked to draft some guidance to issue to the sector. And what was recommended was that you send a letter to providers highlighting that there was clinical advice, pointing to the fact that there was sector-specific guidance coming and providing reassurance to the sector about supporting them for their role. So the question is, was the letter that was then issued on the 13th of March, along with the Scottish Government's guidance, in response to you being told that care homes were closing their doors to admissions, as a way of reassuring them and encouraging them to continue to take discharges?
It was a means of reassuring them to take discharges if they felt that that was appropriate, because it was always their decision whether or not they took any admission to a care home, whether that was someone discharged from hospital or not.
We're going to look at what the letter actually said, but could I first of all ask for a document to be brought up, please? It's INQ 000362665, page 5, and Ms Freeman, if you want to turn it up, it's tab 19. Can we see paragraph 15D, small d? Sorry, it may be page 4. It says the overall objective should be to do everything possible to keep the number of severe cases to a minimum. That is, to reduce hospital admissions and/or deaths among the vulnerable. Can you help us as to why the "or" is in there? So it's to reduce hospital admissions and/or deaths among the vulnerable. Was there any discussion about the need to choose or prioritise between those two?
No.
That can come down now, thank you. Can I ask you about consultation on the policy, please? You met with COSLA on the 4th and the 5th of March 2020, is that right? You refer to in your statement a meeting of the NHS Board Chief Executives on the 11th of March, and what you say in relation to that is that no one identified as a particular risk the movement of people being delayed in hospital to care homes. No one asked for a comparative risk assessment of the respective hospital and care home environments. Rather, there was a consensus at that meeting that delayed discharge had to be effectively tackled. This was a meeting of the NHS Board chief executives. Were there any voices representing the adult social care sector at that meeting?
No.
So why were you expecting anyone, or why do you say no one identified a particular risk? Is that surprising, considering there were no voices of the adult social care sector there?
No, it's not surprising, because NHS Board Chief Executives have medical directors, and they will have consulted with them prior to the meeting itself on a number of issues with respect to the pandemic, and those medical directors will be in contact with our Chief Medical Officer. So they too will have a degree of clinical advice, as I had, on this and other issues. So if any of their individual medical directors had raised a concern, then that Chief Executive would raise that concern with me.
So following the submission on the 11th, the inquiry understands that Health Protection Scotland issued their guidance on the 12th, and then on the 13th, you issued the Scottish Government clinical guidance along with the letter to the sector.
Yeah.
Did you consult with any other voices from the adult social care sector, apart from COSLA, prior to that 13th of March letter being issued?
I believe Scottish Care were consulted.
I think that first meeting was on the 18th of March.
That was their meeting with me. That is not the same as the range of discussions and consultations they would have with my officials.
So what consultation had taken place prior to the 13th of March with the sector, please?
I can't give you specifics on that, because those would not be with me. But my officials were in relatively constant contact with Scottish Care.
Did you yourself seek out the opinions of anyone in the sector on this particular policy?
I would ask my officials if any concerns had been raised with us, with the expectation that they would have been speaking to both local government through COSLA and Scottish Care.
In your statement, you say that admission was by agreement and that the care facility were perfectly able to refuse to take admissions. Can we have a look, please, first of all, at INQ 000470123? This is a letter that was sent out on the 6th of March from the then Director General of Health and Social Care. And can we see in the second paragraph, it says, we now need to be able to create capacity and space within our hospitals. I appreciate that this necessarily increases the pressures on social care systems at a point when there are challenges around how to provide care to vulnerable people in their homes. Nevertheless, I would expect that appropriate steps are being taken in local systems that demonstrates this is being prioritised and driven forward. The expectation being a material reduction in the delayed discharge figures across Scotland. In the immediate term, our requirement is to reduce the overall Scottish delayed discharge position from 1,650 to 1,250 by no later than the 9th of April. Efforts to achieve progressive reductions must continue thereafter. Looking at the wording of that letter, do you have any reflections on whether that letter may have caused some people to understand that they were being asked or required to prioritise accepting hospital discharges?
No, I don't believe so.
Can we look next, please, to another document at INQ 000147441, page 2, paragraph 2, please. This is your letter that was sent out on the 13th, and it says the long-term care and residential care sector is vital to the wider health and social care system. It is essential that it continues to function in an effective way, so that people and communities are supported in the right way. It also, in some cases, provides a safe alternative to more acute settings, including hospital care. It is therefore imperative that care homes continue to take admissions if it is clinically safe to do so. And at page 4, please, the section titled Transitions from Hospital. This is an extract from the Scottish Government guidance itself. It says there are situations where long-term care facilities have expressed concern about the risk of admissions from a hospital setting. In the early stages, where the priority is maximising hospital capacity, steps should be taken to ensure that patients are screened clinically, to ensure that people at risk are not transferred inappropriately, but also that flows out from acute hospitals are not hindered and, where appropriate, are expedited. Looking back, Ms Freeman, do you think that that letter should have more explicitly set out the right of care homes to refuse admissions?
No, because I think care homes were perfectly clear that they had that right, and in some instances appropriately exercised that right. The key word in all of the paragraphs you've highlighted is clinical. So an assessment as to whether or not someone is ready for discharge is a clinical assessment. It's not an assessment made by me or any of my officials or even by a care home. But the care home has the right to see that clinical assessment and take a decision for itself as to whether or not it can appropriately manage the care of that individual in their setting. And they've always had that right, and they had it throughout the pandemic.
Dr Donald Macaskill of Scottish Care gave evidence in Module 2A, and he spoke of care providers from media publicity and also the public messaging that was going out, feeling pressured to take hospital discharges, and also that they felt that they needed to help society. Was that something that you were aware of at the time, that care providers, even if they weren't being told that they had to take discharges, that they were feeling like that they should or felt pressured to?
So I was aware that some may feel that, but you'll also recall, and I think the inquiry has sight of it, Dr McCaskill's own letter to care home providers, to his members, following his meeting with me on the 18th of March, where he urges them to continue to take hospital discharges. and urges them in the strongest terms, I think. So he was understanding of the situation, both the need to free up hospital capacity, of which, as I've said before, delayed discharge was a small component compared to the other steps we took affecting large numbers of people, but also aware, as he rightly should be, of the rights of his members to take a measured decision as to whether or not they could adequately care for someone coming to them from hospital.
Dr. Macaskill had in fact fed back on the draft guidance, and his concern was that what was deemed to be clinically safe or the clinical screening process was not clear enough. And at a meeting with you on the 18th, it was agreed, wasn't it, that a mandatory isolation period would be introduced, and that in fact was not introduced until the 26th of March. Is that right?
I believe so.
Why was there that delay? Because there was no mandatory isolation requirement in the guidance that was issued on the 13th of March. Having had the meeting with him on the 18th, why did it then take until the 26th of March for that mandatory isolation requirement to come in?
So on the 13th of March, from recollection, there was advice to isolate and to practice infection prevention and control. The subsequent position was to make that a requirement as opposed to advice, and also from recollection to say that that period could be completed either in the residential setting or in a mix of the hospital and residential setting. And so the delay, I presume, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't recollect exactly, but I would presume that that was around various toing and froing with Dr. McCaskill, but also our relevant clinical experts on what might be the right thing to do.
Can we turn then to what protections were included and what thinking was done ahead of the policy, please? So as you've pointed out, the guidance on the 13th said that residents should be socially distanced and that visits should be reduced to essential visits. What, if any, consideration had been given at the time to the potential impact of the discharge policy on care homes? For example, did you ask for any modelling to be done, or did you ask for any data?
On what?
To try and work out what the potential impact might be on care homes of the discharge policy.
I'm not sure I understand. The discharge policy was not new to the pandemic. I think I've made that clear. If there were any concerns from care homes about their ability to manage an individual discharged from hospital in terms of the advice and the guidance, they would raise that, and that would come to us from Dr. McCaskill. In terms of modelling and data, I'm still not quite sure what it is you're asking me.
Did you ask for any impact assessments to be carried out?
No. We rested on Dr. McCaskill's relationship with his members and also with COSLA and any concerns to be fed back to us in that way.
Did you make any inquiries as to how many care homes had isolation facilities? Could you have asked, for example, for a list to have been drawn up of care homes with isolation facilities?
So isolation was in the resident's own room. So there wasn't a separate, there wasn't a requirement for separate isolation facilities other than the resident's own bedroom. So I didn't need such a list, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Did you consider whether there are any alternatives to direct discharges into care homes? So, for example, step-down facilities where people being discharged from hospital could go before going into the care homes? So
there are two, yes, that was considered. there are two difficulties with that. One, the availability of step-down facilities, and two, the concern expressed particularly by our geriatrician expert advice about the impact, particularly on an elderly person, of being moved more than once.
Was that Mr. Ellis? I think he was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, is that right?
He was from the 12th of March, but he had been our advisor prior to that appointment.
And did he also have a role in drafting guidance?
Yes, he did.
Work was done on the 6th of March looking at hotel capacity. Was that something that you looked at in terms of step-down facilities?
Yes, it was. The difficulty with looking at something like hotel capacity is how you would staff that. You can't take staff out of care homes in order to staff another facility, nor could we take staff from our NHS to staff another facility. So there were practical difficulties in pursuing that, aside from whether or not hotel capacity was available.
Did you ask for the issue of staff capacity to be looked into?
So the part of our health directorate, which is concerned with staffing and people issues, did consider that. But at the same time, we were busy trying to ensure that we were adequately staffed in both our health and social care sector, in anticipation that our staffing numbers would be reduced because staff themselves would contract COVID, or their family members would, and therefore they would not be in employment. And that is why we launched the portal in terms of returners to adult social care and also to the NHS, but also sought agreement from the regulatory bodies about final year medical and nursing students to be able to operate to the limit of their competence in our health settings.
Forgive me, Ms. Freeman, but can we focus, please, on this period of time? I think the portal, for example, came into, it was established in April.
Yes, it was, but the work that led to the portal was happening at this time.
So focusing on this time and PPE, because you've just been discussing that. The inquiry understands that the submission dated the 11th of March, which first raised the issue for the need for guidance, had also raised issues that providers were finding it increasingly difficult to source PPE, that there were issues about service and provider sustainability, about the costs of self-isolation, and about staffing issues. So when you issued the guidance then on the 13th of March, did you make any provision for care homes to be given extra PPE?
No, I would not specifically at that point. The first triage helpline was the 30th of March, but we would have asked NSS at that point to liaise with Scottish Care to see exactly what was the extent of the problem. Was it individual care homes, or was it a general issue across? At the same time, asking COSLA to identify if they were facing similar issues in local authorities' provision of adult social care.
And was it a widespread issue?
It emerged as one, yes, which is why we introduced the additional routes for the supply and delivery of PPE.
We understand from Ms Lamb's evidence that no funding was provided when the guidance was issued on the 13th of March.
At that point, that's correct.
Is there a reason why financial assistance wasn't given at that stage, knowing that there were concerns about the increased costs of self-isolation?
So there is a process to go through, even in a pandemic, about the use of public funds that requires you to adequately cost what might be needed and where, and then secure that agreement in terms of the proper way in which government makes determination about the use of public funds and then issues it. So that would be the process that would be initiated at that point.
The guidance did recognise that some people might find it difficult to socially distance, for example, people with dementia, and it was recommended that this may be best addressed using volunteers or charitable organisations to engage with those individuals. Did you think about the risk that those individuals would potentially give rise to in terms of transmission?
Yes, and I think subsequent guidance removed that as that understanding increased. I think we were aware of the difficulties in adhering to the guidance to the letter in a setting which is essentially people's home, and there was some flexibility available where it was going to be far too distressing for a resident to be socially distanced, and therefore you would err against requiring that of them.
So is it fair to say then that the main protection that was put into place on the 13th of March from the risk of hospital discharges was asking for residents to be socially distanced and the visiting restrictions?
No. The other protection was isolation in their own room.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
And the application of infection prevention and control.
And do you think that from the submission on the 11th of March and the guidance being issued on the 13th of March, was enough time to give adequate consideration as to what protections were necessary and what potential impact might be, taking into consideration what was known about the vulnerability of care home residents?
Yeah. So there's there's a balance to be struck. Care home providers, through Dr. McCaskill primarily, were asking for guidance in order to help them maintain as safe an environment for their residents as possible and remain open to admissions if they believed they could cope with that in terms of what was required. We were always clear that guidance that was issued would always be iterative, recognising that that in of itself created additional demands on that sector. So I think we struck the balance between responding to a need expressed quite strongly for guidance and a recognition that if you produce guidance reasonably quickly, albeit with a degree of consultation, including with Dr. McCaskill and his colleagues, that as your understanding of the virus evolves, that you will revisit that guidance.
In the BBC podcast, you said, we didn't take the right precautions to make sure that older people leaving hospital, going into care homes, were as safe as they could be, and that was a mistake. Is that something that you stand by?
It was a mistake in the presumption that all our care homes understood infection prevention and control and were practicing it.
Sorry, forgive me. You said that you didn't take the right precautions.
That's right, because I presumed that all our care homes were adhering to the national manual.
So that wasn't referring to other things that you could have done, like PPE provision? That was just in relation
at that
to their
stage,
understanding.
no, but we very quickly did introduce PPE provision. But at that early stage, we were not aware that there was a consistent problem across the sector on securing adequate PPE.
If I may,
again,
oh,
I'm
sorry. Yes.
When you told the podcast we didn't take the right precautions, appreciate that you say that you didn't because it was based on a presumption, but what precautions could you have taken?
So I think we could have introduced earlier, if I had not made that presumption, we could have introduced earlier the wraparound support that we did from directors of public health and nurse directors in each individual board to provide greater clinical support to the care home sector.
Thank you.
And before we end this topic, can I just quote to you 2 accounts from Every Story Matters. The first is from a social worker in Scotland who says, at the beginning, people were discharged into care homes without any testing in place, and also at times without any real assessment to determine the views and wishes of the older people involved. I found this a huge compromise of my ethical values. It was clear that hospitals were becoming overwhelmed. And then another by a loved one of a care home resident in Scotland. 2 people that were discharged from hospital back into care homes having tested negative. 2 days later turned out that they had COVID. It was like my worst fears had been realised. I just kept waiting for the call to say she had COVID. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. It was torture. Ms. Freeman, looking back, do you have any reflections about the decisions that you made in relation to the discharge policy? And do you think that you could or should have taken a more cautious approach?
In the circumstances at the time, with the resources I faced and the understanding that we had of the virus and how it transmitted, I don't believe I could have taken a different decision from the one I took. I have always said that if I had the capacity at the time to test before discharge, I would have done so and did so as soon as that capacity was available, but we did not have it. And so, and as I've also said, but I think it bears repeating, that we were not making binary decisions between a risk-free option and a risk option. We were making decisions between relative degrees of risk.
Can we move on, please, to visiting restrictions? The first restrictions, as we've covered, came into place on the 13th of March in that guidance. And it's right, isn't it, that they weren't fully lifted until 2021?
Yeah, that's right.
In a letter to CPAG, which is the COVID Professional Advisory Group, on the 18th of June 2020, Dr. Macaskill put on record his growing concern about the lack of any communication to the care sector, to families and the wider public about the restoration of visiting into care homes. And he said this: "Today marks the start of the 15th week of lockdown for most of our care homes, during which time there has been minimal visiting other than for essential purposes and end of life. Today is also when it looks as if the First Minister will move the rest of the community to the next stage of leaving lockdown. The complete lack of any public messaging on care homes is causing a real loss of confidence and distress in the sector." One of the concerns raised by Dr. Macaskill was that care homes were being treated as one homogenous group. Do you have a view, Ms. Freeman, on whether it was right to keep the visiting restrictions in place, regardless of whether there was an outbreak in the home, for example, or whether the home provided residential or nursing care, or whether the home was located in a remote location, such as an island community? Were those kind of factors taken into consideration in your decision-making when it came to visiting restrictions?
They were taken into consideration in the clinical advice that I received in terms of whether or not we could lift visiting restrictions, and if so, in what way.
But did you raise any questions outside of the clinical advice that you received?
With whom?
Were those questions in your mind?
Yes, they were in my mind. So I didn't get clinical advice and just apply it. Clinical advice came to me, and discussions were held practically daily with clinical advisors who themselves were reaching out to their own counterparts elsewhere. So it was the product of a number of discussions that then reached a decision.
And the conclusion was to keep a restriction in place across the board?
Yes, I believe that. Without it in front of me, yes, that would have been the case.
Dr. Macaskill went on to say, all in all, we are in an extremely challenging position. there is a real danger that the trust and confidence families have had in care services over the last 14 weeks will be lost unless we do not take action to at least give an indication of when things might change. We urgently need the Cabinet Secretary and First Minister to give such an indication of hope. Was that indication of hope given, and how important do you think it is to maintain the trust and confidence of families and those receiving care during a pandemic response?
So first of all, I think it is important to maintain the trust and confidence of the public, including families, during a pandemic, because without that, people will not comply with the reasonable or with the restrictions, the quite unprecedented restrictions that we were asking them to comply with across the board. So yes, I do think that is really important. At the same time, we have to exercise caution in terms of those individuals who are the most vulnerable to a severe impact of the virus on them and their health. So I was very conscious of, if you like, the social impact of the restrictions that we were requiring people to meet. But that had to be balanced against the risk of vulnerable adults acquiring the virus, where their health was at a greater risk than perhaps others.
Thank you. And the inquiry's also received, through the Every Story Matters project, accounts in relation to visiting restrictions. One care home worker in Scotland talked about challenging behaviour as a result of the visiting restrictions. Another care home worker in Scotland said this: there were no visits or anything for a very long time, which is quite sad. Some of them didn't even recognise who their family were, because by that point they'd totally forgotten, which was really upsetting for the family. Do you consider that the restrictions struck the right balance between the benefits and the risks? And do you think that anything could have been done differently?
So I think at the time, with the knowledge that we had at the time and the clinical and other advice I was receiving, the restrictions struck the best balance that we could at that time. That's not to say that I was unaware or unconcerned about the harms that were also being caused by those restrictions. The entire experience of the pandemic was about the balance of harms. There was no situation at any point where you could make a decision that carried no harm.
Can we move on to guidance, please? It's right, isn't it, that at the beginning of the pandemic, Health Protection Scotland were issuing their guidance. The Scottish Government also issued guidance. And then I think in June, you put into effect what's called the PAC process. And was that effectively a process by which Public Health Scotland had to have guidance signed off by you personally before it was then issued to the public?
Yes.
And the inquiries received evidence that that led to some delays in guidance being published. Is that something that you accept?
There were a few delays, yes. I should be clear that approval by me was not approval of the clinical aspects of guidance.
What was your rationale for?
I wanted the guidance to be clearer than it had been previously.
Can I ask for on screen, please, INQ 000334871, page 2, please, and it's tab 37 if you want to turn it up, Ms. Freeman. This is a WhatsApp conversation between you and Mr. Humza, and if we look at the last paragraph, you're giving him advice on him taking over the role, and you say 4 lines up from the bottom. The other thing is, Public Health Scotland do sometimes need reminding that they're an NHS board like any other and not a bunch of freelancers. They produce a list of forthcoming publications worth looking at to spot potential issues and worth querying some as to who commissioned the work. Did you have any personal reasons for implementing the PAC process? Was there any difficulties in the relationship between you and Public Health Scotland?
I don't believe, excuse me, I don't believe there were difficulties in the relationship between me and Public Health Scotland. But I took the view that I would be accountable for guidance that was issued in any respect by any of our health bodies, and therefore it was responsible of me to ensure that I was content with the guidance that was issued.
The Scottish Directors of Public Health have provided a statement recommending that guidance should be specialist-led and should be a streamlined process. Do you have any reflections on whether the PAC process was in fact necessary and whether it led to unnecessary delays?
I don't believe it led to unnecessary delays. And I think where there were delays, they were very few. I completely agree that guidance should be specialist-led, and I don't believe the PACT process compromised that in any way. However, guidance needs to be written in language that is easily understood by the layperson. And so any interventions that I might have made was about trying to get clearer English as opposed to changing the clinical foundation of the guidance. I had no locus in that, nor did I have any expertise in that, and I was well aware of that fact.
Can we move on, please, to PPE? When did you first become aware of the global issues with PPE?
I'm not sure I can give you a specific point in time. I think early on it was clear there were global issues with PPE because it was a global pandemic.
And I think you say in previous modules evidence that you're aware that care homes would not have had the bargaining power, for example, to compete against the NHS in being able to secure supplies of PPE. Do you have any reflections on whether, with that knowledge, you should have made arrangements earlier on in the pandemic to ensure that the care sector were able to get access to PPE supplies?
I don't believe I should have made any interventions earlier than I did. The care sector is primarily a private sector. It is not part of our health service provision. And they guard that perfectly reasonably in quite a strong way. So it is for them to come to me and say, we are struggling here. And as soon as that was clear, then we intervened and took on the role of securing adequate PPE, both in volume and type, for not only the care sector, but also the care at home sector and other areas, and introduced various improvements to the routes of both demand and supply.
You said a number of times today and also throughout your statement that issues were not brought to you, and when they were, you responded to them. To what extent do you think it's a responsibility of a minister, particularly dealing with a pandemic, to preempt issues that may arise or think in advance and provide support in advance of issues being raised?
I don't think any minister, and I include myself, is godlike in that way. I think that the job of a cabinet secretary is to understand the sector as best as he or she can, to be open to improving that understanding as they go, to listen carefully to clinical and other advice, and to have a number of ways of hearing from individuals charged with the delivery of health and social care and pursuing those. And I think my track record in all of that stands examination. I cannot be an expert in every field. What I can be is clear in seeking evidence and decisive in the decisions I make. And I do believe overall, whilst not perfect, that I was both of those things.
Thank you. Just dealing briefly with testing. Is it right that a decision had been made to test GP surgeries for the purposes of surveillance? That would have covered up to 1.2 million people across all health boards. But it was set out in a briefing note that, in fact, that wasn't the most effective use of the testing because it would have required people to go into the GP surgeries to be tested. With those 1.2 million tests, do you think that those could have been reallocated to the social care sector to allow testing of the sector to be carried out any earlier?
I'm afraid you've lost me a bit. I'm not quite understanding what you're saying. The testing capacity started out at 350 tests per day, and we scaled that up as rapidly as we could, both directly in terms of NHS Scotland, but also with our partners in the rest of the UK through the Lighthouse initiative. So I'm not quite understanding your question.
I think it was later on, there came a time when you did make a direction that the GP surgery should be tested for surveillance reasons. But if you don't remember, perhaps we can move on.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about inspections, please? Did you agree with the decision of the Care Inspectorate to pause regular inspections?
No, I didn't.
What did you do in relation to that then?
So I introduced a regular meeting with the Care Inspectorate and asked them to resume direct inspections, focusing particularly on infection prevention and control, and also on the social aspects of residential care.
Were you aware that one of the issues that they had was that they didn't have access to PPE?
I don't recall that, but I am sure that if that had been an issue, they would have raised it with me and we would have acted to ensure that they did have access to PPE.
We know that the enhanced oversight process came in April, and you gave the Care Inspectorate some enhanced powers, is that right, in relation to reporting?
Yes.
Did they have to report to you regularly on care homes and how they were doing? And did you find that to be an adequate replacement for them carrying out the regular in-person inspections?
So I don't believe it was a replacement. It was what was possible in the circumstances of the pandemic. And they reported from memory. I believe they submitted a report to the Scottish Parliament on a fortnightly basis on their inspections and their findings.
When you told them to resume inspections to deal with the matters you've raised, did they do so?
Yes, they did.
Can I ask you about the enhanced oversight process, please? The inquiry heard evidence from the Care Inspectorate that there were issues in relation to the carrying out of physical inspections because directors of public health were concerned about the risk that would be caused by inspectors going into care homes. Public Health Scotland has also provided a statement to the inquiry saying that it was becoming a very crowded pitch with an increasing number of players who are not all aware of what each other is doing and who is reporting to whom. And forgive me, I think that may be actually in an email rather than in their statement. Do you think that the various roles of the public bodies that were involved in the process were clear throughout?
Well, excuse me, I was clear on their roles, so I presumed that they were too.
What do you think were the benefits of the enhanced oversight arrangements. We know that they required from May multidisciplinary teams going into care homes and assessing the care homes on issues such as IPC and staffing levels. What do you think were the benefits of that support?
So I think particularly in infection prevention and control, whilst it was part of a requirement of a care home provider that they would apply the national manual, it was clear that not all were able or had been doing that. So that enhancement was there to ensure that they were all doing that, and they were given support to be able to practice the levels of infection prevention and control that we required them to practice. And in other areas that they had direct access to local support where they required that.
You say in your statement that you understood that the requirements might create additional burdens for the staff, and in fact a survey carried out later on by Scottish Care confirms that a number of care homes did in fact find it very burdensome. What did you do to try and reduce that burden on staff?
Well, the support that they were offered and could receive from directors of public health in their local area and nurse directors in their local area was part of providing them with additional support. That sector was not the only sector that was under a great deal of pressure, but as in everything during the pandemic, it was a balance of what we believed was required in order to minimise the spread of COVID-19, to care for and those who acquired the infection, particularly those most vulnerable to it, and to minimise deaths as far as we possibly could. So there was never, as I said before, any risk-free decisions.
Is the enhanced multidisciplinary support process something that you would recommend should be put in place in future pandemics at the start of the pandemic?
Yes, I believe so.
Can we move on, please, to DNA CPRs? You say in your paragraph 314 that there were concerns raised with the Scottish Government by third sector stakeholders, including Age Scotland, the public and reports in the media about the use of DNA CPR forms. Can you give us an indication, please, of the scale of the issue as indicated by the anecdotal accounts you were receiving?
So from recollection, it was not widespread by any means, but it was sufficiently concerning for those impacted by it, for us to ensure that everyone was clear about the way in which that conversation should take place, which preceded the pandemic, and the level of support that should be in place in order to conduct those conversations and who should conduct them.
Based on what you were hearing, did you order any investigations to be carried out?
So from recollection, I asked for some work to be carried out to try and identify the extent of this, whether it was widespread or not, and then to take steps to ensure that everyone understood exactly what the policy and the practice of those conversations should be, and the appropriateness of having them at any particular point.
Could I ask for a document to be brought up on screen, please? It's INQ 000147441. This is your letter again on the 13th of March. And if we look at page 3, at the bottom of the page, can we see where it says anticipatory care plans? It says they should be in place for as many residents as possible, and ideally all residents in these settings. Clear documentation of what matters to me is helpful in the event of changing circumstances. In many cases, the staff in the residential or nursing home settings are able to start these conversations. And it goes on to say, do not resuscitate paperwork should be in place where appropriate and communicated appropriately with patients or carers. It may be judicious to ensure that just in case medication is prescribed for high-risk residents. Similarly, verification of death paperwork for appropriate ill patients may help staff to anticipate and manage death and minimise clinical contacts. Did you reflect at all on whether the wording of that may have caused some people to think that there was a suggestion that they should be issued on a more widespread basis?
So I think with the benefit of hindsight, I can see how that may have been the interpretation by some. However, at the time, anticipatory care plans were not new. They had been a feature for some time pre-pandemic. And at the time, the presumption here would be that this was not new to anyone appropriately reading that. I think, as I say, with the benefit of hindsight, understanding that they were not widely applied, then the wording could have been different.
I'd like to just read to you some extracts from Dr. Macaskill's statement of Scottish Care. He says that in response to a number of outbreaks of COVID-19 in care homes on the 5th of May, the then Cabinet Secretary Jeane Freeman said that she was concerned the guidance was not being followed by care homes. She said that the guidance for care home providers was really clear and that private care home providers have not, in some instances, appeared to follow the guidance that we require them to follow. Whilst the Cabinet Secretary referred to some instances, the media seemed to interpret this statement as a criticism of the sector as a whole. This perpetuated the negative narrative that was developing in relation to care homes and led to increased scrutiny of the sector. He goes on to say that the pressure on care home managers to ensure that they were following the most recent guidance was compounded by the announcement by the then Lord Advocate in May 2020 that the death of any care home resident due to COVID-19 or presumed COVID-19 was to be reported to the Procurator Fiscal. The investigations associated with these reports became known as Operation Copa. The decision and the subsequent reporting and investigation of such deaths has caused considerable trauma within the care home sector. Scottish Care recognises that this decision arose from a legitimate desire to provide assurance to the general public. However, its impact has led to many skilled and experienced managers and staff leaving the sector, which undoubtedly contributed to a less resilient response to the pandemic. Have you reflected, Ms. Freeman, on whether the public messages and media narrative that perhaps you may have contributed to in relation to care homes not following IPC guidance, rather than it being framed as perhaps support that could have been given to them earlier on? Have you reflected on what impact that had on the care sector during the pandemic?
So, first of all, it's important to be clear that Operation Copper, as it was referred to, was a decision by the Lord Advocate, and it would be completely inappropriate for me as the Health Secretary to intervene or comment on that decision by the Lord Advocate. So that was for him to make, and where it required the cooperation of government for government to cooperate. In terms of what Dr. McCaskill is quoted as saying, I'm not entirely sure that I would agree with that quote. I think there is a wider context. I think a great deal of support was offered to the care home sector and indeed adult social care in its entirety. On reflection, I think the approach that we took was the correct approach.
And finally, Ms. Freeman, can I ask you about staff movement, please?
Yes.
In your statement, you say that there were issues in Scotland with staff moving between different places of work, which resulted in the spread of infections between care homes. Can you give us an indication of the scale of that issue in Scotland, please?
Right at this moment, I don't believe I can. I think you probably have material that would give you that. It was primarily where, from recollection, it was primarily where a provider had more than one care home and moved staff from one to the other in order to maintain staffing levels. And that clearly created a difficulty in terms of the risk of infection spread.
And I think you issued some guidance in relation to staff movement, advising that staff should not work in more than one facility and that movement between care homes should be restricted. Do you think that in the event of future pandemics, that the movement of staff is something that should be mandated? And do you think that's feasible?
So I'm not sure with the current arrangements of how residential care is provided, i.e. it is a mix of public and private sector provision, primarily private sector, that mandating that is feasible, but that's not to say that the overall nature of our provision of residential adult social care does not itself require some consideration as to whether or not the model that we currently have is the best model. And again, that is something that the FEELE exercise and those recommendations considered.
Thank you, Ms Freeman. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Ms Strong. Ms Mitchell, may you remember that way?
And indeed, you may remember I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. The first question I want to ask you about, a few questions in fact, is about a report from Public Health Scotland titled Discharges from NHS Scotland Hospitals to Care Homes between 1st March and 31st May 2020. In your statement at paragraph 202, I don't need that brought up, you say that the report found that care home size was much more strongly associated with the risk of an outbreak than all other care home characteristics, including hospital discharge. Now, you've fairly noted earlier on that you can't be an expert in every field, and there's a lot of wording in that report, such as confidence intervals, hazard ratios. What assistance did you receive in understanding and interpreting the statistical analysis contained in this document?
First of all, we asked for that work to be undertaken, and it was undertaken by the Universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. So it was an independent report. In terms of its overall remit and then understanding its conclusions, both its initial conclusions and I believe a subsequent report was then produced later, then I would receive advice primarily from the Office of the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer.
And was that in relation to understanding and interpreting the statistical analysis?
To a degree, yes.
Did you have confidence in that regard that you understood what the report was saying to you?
Yes, I did.
Moving on then, there's a table, again, I don't need it brought up, but there's a table in this report comparing periods without a hospital discharge to periods otherwise otherwise in non-pandemic times with discharge. And it talked about a risk and confidence interval. What it says is this. Compared to periods without hospital discharge, there was an increased risk of an outbreak observed in the period immediately after hospital discharge. The confidence interval includes 1.0, that's a reference point, i.e. the risk of an outbreak with no discharge, which means the risks in period with a discharge is not statistically significant from periods without a discharge. So that was saying at that point, and this was the original report, that statistically they didn't see a difference. However, it went on to say the confidence interval is relatively wide, which means there is uncertainty about the true risk, ranging from an 8% lower risk of care home outbreak in the period soon after a hospital discharge to a 52% higher risk. And the report goes on to say at that point, we therefore cannot rule out a small risk from hospital discharge. What did you understand that to mean when you read it?
precisely what it says, that they could not rule out a small risk from hospital discharge.
And what about the 8% to 52% risk? Did you realise and understand that that was a wide uncertainty about the true risk?
Yes, I did.
Now, the reporting of the statistical modelling in part 2, the part that we've been discussing, which analyses the risk of care from care home outbreaks associated with hospital discharge, was updated following feedback from the Office for Statistics Regulation. And in fact, this inquiry has a letter from Ed Humferson, who's the Director General for Regulation at the Office of Statistics, to Scott Heald, the Head of Professional Statistics for Public Health Scotland, regarding the findings from the discharges of NHS Scotland hospitals to care homes. Were you aware of that letter?
Yes.
That letter came on the 14th January 2021. And when discussing the data contained in another table, Table 11, Mr Humferson stated, when looking at the different types of discharge, we see adjusted hazard ratios of 1 for tested negative, 1.7 for untested, and 1.45 for tested positive. Although the confidence intervals again suggest these findings are not significant, the observed, and in quotations, dose-response pattern in the adjusted hazard ratios is consistent with a causal relationship between positivity and outbreak. What did you understand that to mean?
So my understanding of both the earlier report and that subsequent one is that it was not possible to discount the risk of hospital discharge in terms of infection in care homes, but it was not the most significant risk. The most significant risk was, from memory, the size of the care home.
So you accept that the data was consistent with a causal relationship between positivity and outbreak in care homes?
To the extent that I've said that, yes.
Moving on, we have heard evidence this morning from Alistair Donaldson, and the inquiry also has the benefit of his statement. He was a member of the DHSC's Adult Social Care Policy from April to October of 2020 and was officially responsible for creating the Vivaldi project. Were you aware of the project at the time?
I don't believe so, no.
Were you aware of its findings later?
I can't recollect them.
In his statement, and simply for the purposes of the inquiry, that's at paragraphs 31 and 32 of his statement, he discusses how politicians in England use the Vivaldi data in relation to discharge in care homes, and he states the following. But again, the study suggested how the disease was being spread within and between homes in May. Our data was not able to give definitive insight into how the virus got into many homes in the first place back in March, for the simple reason that there had been little or no testing back then. And I pause to say there was little or no testing in Scotland. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Indeed, staff movement between homes would not have been so dangerous if the homes themselves had been genuinely protected in the first place, rather than full of the virus. I believe this is very important because, perhaps in a psychologically understandable effort to absolve themselves of their responsibility for the original decision to discharge thousands of people from hospitals into homes without quarantines or test, our study has been used to suggest that such a policy was not dangerous, when in my view, as a matter of basic epidemiology and simple common sense, it probably was very dangerous indeed. Absence of evidence cannot be claimed to be evidence of absence, and there is no good data for the period when the main hospital discharge occurred for the same reason it was potentially so reckless, because there was no testing. Reflecting on what he has said about the fact that there was no testing, do you consider that the Scottish data contained in the Public Health Scotland report is not able to give a definitive insight into how COVID-19 got into many Scottish care homes in March 2020?
I think it gives as good an insight as it could at that time. I think there are other factors to be considered. For example, from my recollection, 843 individuals were discharged from hospital to care homes, and 348 were involved in care homes were involved in an outbreak. So, for example, a number of care homes who received a discharge from hospital did not have an outbreak of COVID. So, I think this is a complex and complicated question. And the area we've not touched on is the risk to those individuals of remaining in hospital when they were clinically able to be discharged.
I think the Chair has already heard evidence in that regard, so that the Chair is already aware of that situation. But do you agree, as a matter of basic epidemiological and simple common sense, that discharge of untested patients from hospitals to care and nursing homes in Scotland was probably, and I quote, very dangerous indeed?
No, I don't agree that it was very dangerous indeed. I believe that decision, like many others, carried a degree of risk. As I've said earlier, there were no risk-free decisions in any of this at any point. And I believe that the mitigation measures that we put in place were there precisely because we did recognise the level of risk involved.
But you've accepted in your evidence earlier that part of the mitigation process or procedures that were put in place you thought was happening when it wasn't.
That's true, and was subsequently addressed.
So the decision taken to have the discharge was taken place on an understanding which wasn't correct about the risks.
It was taken on an understanding that proved itself to be incomplete, but that does not answer the question as to why some of our care homes that received discharge from hospital did not have an outbreak and some did.
Well, given the lack of testing, how could it be that a proper clinical analysis could be done before deciding to send someone to a care home?
So that is for clinicians to answer, not me as a non-clinician, I believe. No one is discharged from hospital without a clinical assessment as to whether or not that is appropriate. That clinical assessment is then for the individual care home to determine whether or not they wish to accept that discharge.
And I understand that, but I wonder if my lady would allow me to ask a follow-up question.
Well, in fact, if you want to, the point of the question was the point about the testing. Clinical assessment is obviously not for you, but I think the point, so follow it up.
I'm obliged, my lady. The question, as my lady has identified, is about the testing. You knew as Minister there was not the ability to test.
Yes.
Therefore, how could it be that you considered that a proper clinical analysis could be carried out before deciding to send someone to a care home if you knew that there was no testing?
I'm genuinely not sure I understand your question. I certainly knew at that point in the early stages of the pandemic we did not have sufficient testing capacity to undertake those tests. Whether or not someone was clinically able to be discharged from hospital was a clinical assessment. Whether or not the care home accepted them was a care home decision. And what we put in place to mitigate against the absence of testing were the measures that you're aware of. I'm not suggesting that they were fully adequate, but they were the only measures available to us at that point. And the alternative was to leave someone ready for discharge in hospital, which was a high-risk environment given the level of COVID patients, and an environment that prior to the pandemic was widely understood as one that would carry a serious risk of physical and mental deterioration.
I'll perhaps simply try the question a different way. What did you consider the purpose of requiring tests and getting tests into hospitals as soon as possible for people being discharged was? What was the point of them?
It was an additional mitigation measure.
An additional mitigation measure. Do you not think it with respect, would be the primary mitigation measure?
No, I don't, because, as you'll know, there were, in the early stages of testing, concerns around the validity of test results. That improved over time, of course, but the test itself was not the silver bullet.
We had people going from hospitals into care homes without being tested, which is one procedural mitigation, as you've described it, and then also going into care homes which did not or were not able, or for some reason you say weren't carrying out the tests that were required. So both of those procedural safeguards were not sufficient. Is that correct?
So the care home procedural safeguard was a practice of infection prevention and control as required by their contract and set out in the manual. As experience demonstrated, was not universally practiced in all care homes.
Moving on, if some GPs were refusing to visit care homes, as this inquiry has heard, and not going into care homes meant that residents were not being tested, what, if any, impact do you consider that that had on the data contained in the Public Health Scotland report?
I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer that. There certainly were concerns around GPs being unwilling to go into care homes that we sought to address directly. Whether or not that had an impact on the data that the independent report from Edinburgh and Glasgow produced, I don't believe I am equipped to comment on that. I do believe if those two universities had felt that they did not have adequate data to undertake the work, they would have raised that and made that clear.
I think, in fairness, in that report, they do make clear the relative limitations.
They do.
In that report. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Mr McCaskill has also indicated that there were feelings of what he described as clinical abandonment. Now, in relation to care homes. Now, when taken alongside the lack of testing to care homes in March 2020, would that cause you to reconsider your views on the impact of the discharge of untested patients into the care homes?
I think the only difference it would make is that I would have introduced the engagement of directors of public health and nurse directors sooner than we did.
And you say earlier on, one of the questions I think has already been answered, that you were aware of GPs being unwilling or refusing to attend care homes and there was an intervention. Can you explain to us when you took the steps to address it, when you became aware of it and when you took the steps to address it?
I'm afraid I don't have those specific dates in mind. What I do recall is that in circumstances like that, and this is purely an assertion on my part, I believe the dates, if we check them, will back this up. But as soon as I was aware of issues like that, then I acted as quickly as I could to address them.
We'll be able to look at the evidence of Mr McCaskill in that regard. Again, moving back to Mr Donaldson, who gave evidence this morning, in his statement to this inquiry, he said that the reason why so many thousands of excess deaths in care homes in England were not reported was a result of there not being enough tests to establish that these were COVID infections in the first place. Do you consider there is the possibility that many deaths in care homes in Scotland were not reported as COVID deaths because there was a lack of testing?
I don't believe that I am qualified to answer that question. I think the body in Scotland that produced the data on deaths because of COVID or where COVID is mentioned in the death certificate is better placed than I to say whether they believe the data they drew that from was adequate or not.
And was that something that you considered at the time? When you were looking at the number of COVID deaths, did you think, if there's not testing, how are we able to get this number?
No, I don't believe I did consider that at the time.
Moving then on to my final question, it relates to evidence that we heard earlier this morning from yourself about the data system for adult social care, which I think you called Sentinel, is that correct?
Sentinel.
Sentinel, sorry.
It's the surveillance system.
The surveillance system, and that is a surveillance system for adult social care?
No, it's a surveillance system for health in Scotland.
Okay, which
not confined to adult social care.
Okay, but includes adult social care.
Yes, it does.
Yes. So, you said, and I'm not quoting exactly here, but broadly, you said that it relied on GP practice to provide data on infection and other data around the provision of care, the quality of care and the adequacy of staffing via the Care Inspectorate when you were talking about care homes. Is that correct?
Not quite. The Sentinel exercise is simply around the prevalence of infection, and that was existed pre-COVID and comes through GP practices. The other matters are around the Care Inspectorate and their inspections and the information that they provide from those inspections.
I see. So the former only relates to the GP practice and infection, and the latter about care relates to the Care Inspectorate.
Yes.
Given that the inquiry has heard of the limited contact with some care homes of GPs, you've touched on it earlier yourself, and also the cessation of contact with the Care Inspectorate, this means it would appear that you weren't getting the provision of data on infection and also the provision of care, the quality of care, the adequacy of staffing and the Care Inspectorate was also not there. Does this mean that the data system wasn't, or does this mean that this system wasn't fit for purpose to give you the information about adult social care?
So I think there's no question that the system at that point was not as useful as we would have wished it to be. However, the Sentinel system, it does not rest on every single GP practice. As I recall it, it is a system that statistically takes what the individual practices involved say and projects that to give you a Scottish-wide position. And during the pandemic, we increased the number of GP practices that were engaged in providing data for the Sentinel system. The inspections from the Care Inspectorate, as you rightly say, on the 13th of March, they paused their inspections. And you'll also know that as soon as possible thereafter, I required them to recommence their inspections.
Does that mean that the system for a time wasn't fit for purpose?
So there would be a period when the information coming via the Care Inspectorate was not as adequate as I wished it to be.
Or indeed at all, because there was a cessation in...
Well, no, there was a cessation of their in-person inspections and they moved to, I suppose, Teams or Zoom type inspections, which I did not consider adequate.
Milady, that's my time and those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. Very grateful. That completes the question we have here. And I gather from making inquiries that maybe it's the last time that we'll be asking you to assist us. So I appreciate it's been quite a burden. 5 times? Is this the 6th time?
6th.
6th. That's quite a lot to ask of you, and I'm really grateful for the help you provided to the inquiry.
Thank you, my lady. I appreciate it.
I shall return at 2 o'clock.
All right.